very few Jews or Arabs living in the land at all. A very bleak land. It had the potential to be developed, but it wasn't developed. It was neglected, it was barren, and it was almost lifeless. That's the picture that we're starting with, because we want now to look at a sequence of events that lead us from that time. First of all, then, we'd like to look at a promise, or a number of promises. We said God's promise in the singular, because these different aspects are all part, really, of the same promise. If we look at the prophecy through Jeremiah and the 30th chapter, again thinking back to the fact that Palestine was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, that it was virtually a barren place with hardly anybody there at all, some nomads, but very few Jews, very few Arabs. And in Jeremiah chapter 30, this is what the prophet said, something like 2,500 years ago. This is God's promise. In verse 3, "For lo, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people, Israel and Judah, saith the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it." Now, 150 years ago, that prophecy would still have been something which would be thought of as being out in the future, if it's going to happen at all. But clearly God said what he was going to do. Just picking up those two aspects that the prophet talks about the captivity of, or God speaking through the prophet says about the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, the two sections of what was the nation of Israel. If we turn over to the prophecy through Zechariah, next to the last book in the Old Testament, and the 12th chapter, we see that the prophet Zechariah, speaking about this time of restitution, this time of regathering of the nation of Israel and Judah, as it was described in that chapter. In Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 7, very precisely the prophet says, verse 7, "The Lord also shall save the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem do not magnify themselves against Judah." So that's saying that although God has promised in Jeremiah 30 that he will bring about the return of all of Israel back to the land that he promised to the fathers of that nation, there would in fact be a partial regathering first, which is described here as being the tents of Judah, or one part of the old kingdom of Israel. If we go to the prophecy through Ezekiel and the 36th chapter, Ezekiel chapter 36, and reading from verse 10, God says through the prophet, "I will multiply men upon you," speaking of the land of Palestine, "I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, even all of it, and the cities shall be inhabited, and the wastes shall be builded." Now that's talking about wasteland, and that's a phrase that adequately describes, or appropriately describes, the land of Palestine as it would have been seen if we could have gone there 150 years ago. So, just to summarise the key points of the passages we've looked at. "For lo, the days come, saith the Lord, I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, and cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it." God says that first of all, he would save the tents of Judah, a preliminary, partial regathering of that nation back to this land. And again, God says that the waste cities will be rebuilt, the waste land inhabited. If we just have a look now, we said we wanted to look at one or two extracts from that book, which shows the way in which the prophecies of the Bible would be interpreted, despite the fact that the events at the time of this interpretation would seem to be impossible. Very precisely, the interpretation was as follows: "There is then a partial and primary restoration of Jews before the manifestation," that is, before Jesus returns. And that was written in 1848, a long time before it even looked a distinct possibility. But there it is, a partial and primary restoration of Jews before the return of Jesus Christ. Notice there again the question of the waste shall be builded. And if we turn over to Ezekiel chapter 38, again another quotation with regard to the state of the land and what is to happen to that land. In Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 8, we read there, "After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. But it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them." Now, it would have been a very brave man, apart from having the scriptures to identify these issues. It would have been a very brave man 150 years ago to say that the land which had been laid waste for centuries would have been brought back and a nation would dwell there. But that's exactly what the Bible said, despite what appeared to be an impossible dream at the time. The land that is brought back from the sword is gathered out of many people, a land which was always waste, and that truly is the description of the land as it was. Now, we've taken a quotation there from Mark Twain, because Mark Twain, in the year 1867, actually went for a tour around Palestine to see for himself exactly what the state of the country was. So this would be round about the time that those extracts from Elpis Israel were written. In fact, they were written 20 years before this. "A desolate country, whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds. A silent, mournful expanse. We never saw a human being on the whole route. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country." So that's how it appeared. And just to illustrate the remarkable change that took place after that time, it is brought forth out of the nations. We just take one example, and it's the city of Tel Aviv. In 1909, that gathering of perhaps 100 people looked in this barren wilderness place. And 100 years later, that's what it looked like and looks like today. A desert land, a wasteland, but now a thriving activity, a city of activity. And that is reflected in many places in the land of Palestine under the control of God's people of Israel. So coming back now to God's promise, if we turn to Ezekiel chapter 36 and the 10th verse, God says there in verse 10, "I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, even all of it, and the city shall be inhabited, and the waste shall be builded. And I will multiply upon you man and beast, and they shall increase and bring fruit. And I will settle you after your old estates, and will do better unto you than at your beginnings. And ye shall know that I am the Lord. Yea, I will cause men to walk upon you, even my people of Israel, and they shall possess thee, and thou shalt be their inheritance, and thou shalt no more henceforth bereave them of men." So again, we've got this statement, this confirmation of the things that God is going to do. That, as verse 8 says, Ye, O mountains of Israel, ye shall shoot forth your branches, and yield your fruit to my people of Israel, for they are at hand to come. And it paints a picture here of a people that are returning to a land that their forefathers lived in centuries before, but not as a religious people, as sometimes they're presented with the ideas of Zionism and so on, but a people not believing in God particularly, a people just looking for somewhere that they could once more call home, having been dispersed amongst the nations of the earth. So again, just a quotation to highlight, again at a time when it was a waste and desolate land, it was written in this way: on the basis of these prophecies, the pre-adventual colonisation of Palestine will be on purely political principles, and the Jewish colonists will return in unbelief of the messiahship of Jesus, and that's true even today. They will emigrate thither as agriculturists and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their commonwealth. Now that was written 150 years ago, when it wouldn't even have been considered by most people that ever that land could be tilled, that it could be populated, and that it could be a fruitful land as we see it today. The pre-adventual colonisation of Palestine will be on pure